Steph discovered her love for teaching at a young age. She began her career as an educator, and during this time, her firstborn child was facing some really difficult health stuff. So she decided to completely overhaul their diets to figure out the root cause. She went back to school to pursue a master's degree in holistic nutrition and went on to open a practice to help families who face similar challenges. Fast forward, Steph hired David Neagle and his team, Life is Now Inc., as her health practices business coach. As she continued to scale her business, her love for entrepreneurship and growing businesses shined through. She sold her business at the age of 33 and joined Life is Now Inc. as the director of sales in 2009 before taking on the CEO role less than a decade later in 2016. Please welcome Steph Tuss to the show. How are you, my friend?
I am so well. How are you?
I'm doing good too. I'm excited to hear about your journey because it sounds fascinating. I love the fact that you took something that really was probably very scary at the time and really turned it around and has led you where you're at today. Our biggest question for people today is the biggest mistakes that we're making in sales. And I think that your journey ties beautifully into this subject. So let's dive into it. Let's talk about all of our mistakes because I know I've made a ton. I'm sure you've made a ton. Everybody out there listening has probably made a ton. So let's dive into it.
Sounds great. I have made lots of mistakes in my life. And I think now in the position that I'm at right now, I have a very different view of mistakes than I did when I first started. Mistakes were always very painful, right? You're taught from a young age that mistakes are painful. Mistakes can be embarrassing. Mistakes can be emotionally painful. Mistakes can be physically painful depending on how you grow up. So you're always taught to avoid mistakes. I mean, you make a mistake in class, you're humiliated, right? So I think in our own upbringings, we've been taught that mistakes aren't a good thing. But when you look at business, when you look at sales, when you look at business, when you look at leadership, actually every single aspect of business, you begin to notice that mistakes are required. You don't grow without making mistakes. So the sooner you can sunshine those mistakes and talk about them and learn from them, the faster you grow through them and you don't make the same mistake again.
That's so interesting because when you said that, it like brought me back to Spanish class about like being terrified to make a mistake or say the wrong thing, when really that probably should have been the most open environment to make mistakes. And really how that you're right. It's like in business, like that's how you learn. Like that's how we figure things out is by making mistakes. And it's kind of the norm in business, but back in school, completely the opposite. I'm so glad you brought that up because I never really thought about it until you just said that. And I was like, wait a second. You're right. We are taught that mistakes, you shouldn't be making them. But really, that's what makes us so strong as entrepreneurs.
Right. I mean, think about just how I can speak to this because I was an elementary school teacher for 10 years,
Oh,
right?
wow.
You grade papers, you get red marks on your papers for making mistakes. That's a negative thing. Like, oh, I got a D or oh, I got a C, rather than like, let's look at what happened. Let's change how we're thinking about this and viewing this. And so the number one thing that we really run into with entrepreneurs, especially once they've built their business to a certain level, is that deep fear of making a mistake or making the wrong decision, because the wrong decision could lead to a big mistake. And the truth is that there really aren't any wrong decisions, right? You either win or you learn. But that's Jason Mraz, right? Lyrics from a Jason Mraz song. You either win or you learn. Like that's all there is. That's all there is to it in business. And if a mistake is painful, it's because you're making it mean something about you rather than making it mean something about what's going on in the business and being able to learn from it.
Well, and I think too, there's so many times that, especially like if you're new to sales, that it becomes a really painful process. And then, of course, we create this big, hairy, ugly monster, and it's really not as intimidating as it seems. But what are some tips that you have to make it easier on ourselves when we are, making those sales, or maybe we're in the beginning of our career and we're learning how to sell?
So I think the first thing is to not make it personal, right? Sales feels very vulnerable because especially if you're selling your own services, your own knowledge base, maybe something that you've created. You're selling kind of a piece of yourself, right? So it's a little bit vulnerable to say, hey, do you want this? And then to be open to that rejection. But the first thing to understand is that when someone says no, they're not saying no to you. They're saying no to themselves, right? So to be able to separate yourself from the actual sale is not a reflection of your value or who you are. It's a reflection of whether or not it's a right fit for the person on the other line. So if you can kind of begin to reframe that, it takes a little bit of that like personal element out of it. And then you can come from a place of quite simply, how can I help this person? Because really the goal of a sales call, and this is my opinion, the goal of a sales call when I'm having a call with someone is to create clarity in a confused mind. A lot of people get on sales conversations and they're really confused as to what they actually need or what problem they actually need to solve. So I view my role in sales as helping them understand what that problem really is so that they can make a decision on what's the best next step for them. So it's really coming from a place of service rather than of getting something from someone.
I feel like that's where we as commission-only salespeople really get a bad rap, because when we are pushing our agendas or our needs onto someone else of, "You've got to buy this thing," whatever that is, that's when people are like, "Ooh, I don't want that, I don't want you, I don't want anything to do with you," because it just becomes uncomfortable and slimy. What
Right.
are some ways that we can help get ourselves not to that point, so we can say, okay, I need to pull back and realize that I need to focus on this person that I'm helping versus on my needs?
So the first thing is, if you're talking more than your prospect is talking, that's not a good sales conversation, right? A sales conversation should be full of questions. The idea is that you're info gathering and you're info gathering in a way that serves both of you. So first thing is, in order to put your prospect at ease, take control of the conversation. So that was one of the first mistakes I made is, being female, being younger at the time. I mean, I started in sales when I was, I don't know, late 20s. I would get on the phone and I had this idea that, oh, I had to like build rapport first. Like I have to build this know, like, and trust. Like, oh, hi, how are you doing? Is now a good time? But really what people are looking for is confidence so that they know that they don't have to be in control of the conversation. So getting on the phone and saying, hey, I'm so glad we're on the phone. We set this call because of this, and here's what's going to happen in the next 15 minutes. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. It's going to help us understand what we each do and get clear on if this is the best next step. And then at the end, I'm going to make an offer for something that might help you, and you get the opportunity to say yes or no. How does that sound? And the other person on the other line is suddenly at ease because they know what to expect and they know that you've got control of the conversation. But it feels really uncomfortable at first to do that because like socially there are ways that you're supposed to approach a sales conversation, right? With the niceties and the greetings and the 5 minutes of, oh, how's the weather where you are and where are you from stuff that actually doesn't matter at all and just solidifies confusion in your prospect's mind.
I love that, because I think it's one thing, especially when we are as young women, there's so much going on with, how much do we have a quota? Do we not have a quota? What do we need to sell? There's so much that goes into it, and really dialing in and focusing on the other person's needs. I just love the fact too that you're like, I'm going to lead this conversation. I'm going to be the leader to help you fix this problem. It's just amazing. What do you think are some other places or other parts of sales where people struggle with that you've seen?
I see people struggle when they're trying to use a script. So they're in their head about what questions they need to ask, but they're not actually listening to the other person. And I'll give you a perfect example of this, right? Totally unrelated. Well, kind of related, but perfect example of this, right? So I go to buy a car and I walk onto the lot and I'm looking at cars, and the car salesperson, I think that's what they're called, the salesperson walks up to me and starts talking to me about the car that I'm looking at. And he's literally telling me like what the engine size is and how fast it is and what type of gas. And really, I'm looking at two big things in this car. How many cup holders it has, and does it have heated seats and a heated steering wheel, right? Like, I don't care how fast the car goes. That's not important to me. But he never thought to ask me what's important to me, to understand how I'm going to make my buying decision. And I think that's a big mistake that a lot of people make in sales, is that they're simply just dumping information on someone, saying, this is what we do, and this is how we can help you, and this is why we're so good. They're convincing rather than actually listening to the person, so the person feels heard and then has the confidence in you to direct them to the next thing. So even just by starting the question with, what do you want? Obviously, simple question. Like, what is it that you'd like? What do you desire? What's your goal? Depending on what you're selling, like, what is the end result that you want from this thing? And then why do you want that? Why is that important to you? What's going to happen if you don't get this? Or what's going to be a deal breaker if you don't get this? And asking those questions so that you can understand, even if you can help them, or your service or product can help them. And then they feel they're having someone ask them questions. No one's asked them these questions before. So they're gaining confidence in your ability to help them decide what is the next best thing for them. And then the other big mistake I see is people will get really well into the sales conversation. They'll have asked great questions. And then when it comes time to actually make an offer, they display a smorgasbord. They're like, you can have this with this and this, and you can have this with this and this and this, and you can have this with this and this and this. And I mean, we all know a confused buyer doesn't buy, right? So the idea is that once you take that authority in a sales conversation and you've got that authority, the idea is that you think about what's the program or service that's best going to meet their needs, and that's the one thing that you offer, knowing that if it's not a right fit, you can always make an offer for something else. But putting it all out there just results in confusing the prospect.
I'm glad that you brought that up because you and I are on the same wavelength, because I literally was just gonna be like, okay, we have to talk about the offer. Cause that is what I hear from so many people. They're like, I struggle with this. Like, I know my thing can help my prospect, but how do I get them to know that? How do I get to the offer
But
phase?
here's the thing. People don't buy the thing, they buy the result that the thing's going to provide. So if you've done a really good job of helping them see how you can get them to that result, it actually doesn't matter what the thing is, right? So a lot of people spend all this time laying out this big proposal, all these nuts and bolts and pieces and all this value add stuff, but there's a disconnect because they don't see how that thing is going to equal this result. And they don't excite the possibility that they could even have that next result that they want. So the idea is, if you do a great job in the sales conversation up front by taking control, by asking the right questions, by letting them know that, wow, we can absolutely help you with this. We've helped other people with this, achieve this in this much time. The actual nuts and bolts of whatever it is you're offering really aren't that important. In fact, we've had people purchase programs from us and then send an email later saying, I'm so excited to be in this program, but can you remind me what's actually included?
I love that. They have fed off your energy and they're excited because they know this thing that you're selling is going to help fix their problem. And at the end of
Yes,
the day, that's really the goal, is to help people solve those problems that they're struggling with.
right.
I love that. So, any other tips that you have for us that you're like, hey, this is a golden nugget that you definitely want to make sure is included more towards the beginning of your sales conversation?
I think that in the beginning of your sales conversation, you want to listen for any kind of emotional change, because an emotional change in tone signals where you need to kind of what we call dig in questioning. So if you're asking someone, why do you want this thing? And their tone of voice changes and it gets softer, you know that you've hit on something that's important to them. So you might want to ask another question. Well, tell me about that. What would it feel like for you to have this? Or why is this so important to you? Or I heard you get a little emotional. Tell me about that. Like, what's going on with that thing? And give them permission to talk a little bit more about why this one thing is really important to them, or why they want to change this one thing. Listening for tonal changes is a game changer in sales conversations, because it will give you a hint as to when someone's telling you the truth when someone is, you've hit on an emotional note that you could possibly even go into a little bit deeper with them in, or if they're just flat out not interested and shut down. And we've all had those sales conversations too, right? I mean, you all know, you get on a phone conversation and you can clearly see someone's upset about something. Generally, I'll just stop the whole thing and say, you know what, I'm really picking up that something's bothering you. Is there anything that I can help you with? Like, is something wrong? Do we need to reschedule? And it just, to have someone even notice that for them, they usually just go right back into the sales. No, it's okay. I just had, I had my boss come in and say something to me and it was upsetting, but I'm okay. Thank you for asking. And you've just created a relationship with someone,
Well,
right?
I think that's a really huge thing that a lot of us forget because we're not actively listening. We're
Right.
like, okay, how am I going to respond? What this person said this, I'm going to get ready with this response, when really it's about listening to
Yeah.
what that person needs. Like you just mentioned, something that they might be going through. So that way you can clear that up and move back into the sales conversation. What do you like? What are some really good tips if someone is like, I know I need to be a better listener? Like, how would you train someone to be a better active listener?
So, put the script aside, trust yourself, listen, let yourself mess it up, let yourself have a terrible sales conversation, like give yourself permission to just completely flub it up. And then the other one is take 1 or 2 breaths before you respond after someone finishes speaking. A lot of times, pacing is really key in a sales conversation. If someone stops talking and you just sit and just like think, they feel really heard, and you've got a chance to like think about what you want to say without trying to think about what you want to say while they're saying something, which means you're not listening. So there's nothing wrong with pauses in sales conversations. Actually, slower pacing is generally way better than just like, interview style rocket questions at someone, because then they know that you're not listening. And then the other tip in terms of listening is I used to put a Post-it note on my screen, and the Post-it note says 2 words: shut up.
That is a very good reminder.
I would look at that and be like, shut up. Okay, I'm just asking questions. I'm asking leading questions. Shut up. Because I had a bad habit of doing the okay, I understand. And that is a sure sign that you are not listening. Like, a listener is quiet. They're making eye contact through Zoom. They might be taking some notes, but they're not saying, mm-hmm, uh-huh. That's a really bad habit, and it just shows that you're not listening.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up too that we have to give ourselves grace too, because not every sales conversation is going to be amazing and you're going to sell every single time. What are some tips that you have if we just totally bombed it? Like, we've given ourselves grace to be like, okay, whew, that one could have been better. I could have done a lot differently there. What are some tips that you have for just like, okay, how do we let it go? How do we let it go so we can move on to the next one and just process through it?
So how I used to do this was I would journal out. So I would just kind of take notes on what happened and what points I got stuck on, so that I could reframe and work through those areas. I also would record some of my own sales conversations and listen back so I could find the point where I felt like I was losing control of the conversation. So the idea wasn't to like self-flagellate. Like, my idea wasn't to abuse myself over it. It was to, okay, that sucked, and I'm going to go back and figure out where it went wrong so that I can fix it so that it doesn't go wrong again. So I just saw every sales conversation, and I had a lot of bad sales conversations. There was actually a sales conversation one time where I called the person back and apologized. Like, I was like, I was not present for you in this sales conversation. I think you're a great fit for our program, and I'm wondering if you give me a second chance to have another conversation with you. And she did. So I also don't think there's anything wrong with calling a prospect back and either saying, hey, can I give it one more go because I was not my best self, and or, hey, have you changed your mind? right? Like a no is not a no forever. A no is a no while you're on the phone with them. It doesn't mean it's a no tomorrow. So, we're in the habit of absolutely calling clients back and saying, hey, just wondering if you had a change of heart, if you've changed your mind, and want to reconsider moving forward with us. But in terms of, bombing a sales conversation, you're always going to hear more no's than yeses. So it's just a part of life. It's just a part of sales, right? And B, every time you make a mistake, prepares you to be better on your next call. And that's really how you need to reframe it. It doesn't mean anything about you personally. It's just an opportunity for growth.
Well, and to be able to say, they're not all gonna be perfect. They're not all gonna be amazing. There's mistakes are gonna happen, and that's just part of it, and giving yourself grace to allow that, I think is such good advice because I don't know about anybody listening out there, but I tend to, like, beat myself up when I'm like, "Oh, I could have done that better. Oh, I shouldn't have said that." And I think too, like you mentioned, like, being able to go back and listen and be like, "Oh, there's where we went wrong." Like, knowing that after the fact, I think is huge and can only develop you as a sales leader that much more because you're willing to say, I know I need to improve. And the only way to do that is to make mistakes. And that's
Yeah.
okay.
That's okay. I think that's the fastest way, honestly, to get better at sales is to do spot check listens to yourself because you can so clearly hear it. You can so clearly hear it when you're not in it, right?
Right.
When you're standing outside and you're looking in, you're like, ooh, that probably wasn't the best thing to say there. I could have said this different, or I missed this cue, which then just makes you more aware of it in your next conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there is one question that I ask every single guest on my podcast is if you could give one piece of advice to a small business owner, someone listening today, what would it be?
Sales is service. Sales is not doing something to someone, it's doing something for someone. And change happens with sales. No matter what type of thing you're looking at in life, sales are everywhere. You go see a good movie, and what's the first thing you want to do? Reach out and tell a friend about it. That's a sale, right? You're a small child and you've got a Christmas list and you're asking for things for Christmas and you're saying why. That's a sale. Like the world runs on sales, whether money is attached to it or not. We're all salesmen. So I always kind of cringe when someone's like, oh, I'm not a salesperson. Yes, you are. You are a salesperson. You just haven't connected that sales is service and that it's okay for you to charge money for what it is that you offer because there's value in that. So looking at reframing sales as something that's fun, something that's helping people, something that's giving them an opportunity to change something or be something different or have something different is such a huge gift. And change just doesn't happen without sales, period.
I love how you reframed it too, because I think that's the biggest takeaway from this is that sales is not a bad thing. Like you're helping someone solve a problem that they have, really filling that void that they may or may not know that they need, because I think that happens a lot. People don't know that they need us. One last question because I feel like this is so important is that if you have this amazing thing that you're selling, so it's something that you've created, it's this thing that you have and you know that it can change lives of people that you've met with, what is the best way to get over that? I don't know if it's good enough. How is like what's the best way to get over that? Because I meet so many amazing women, I'm sure you do too, that you're like, this thing could change lives, but that person might not think that it can.
The person on the other end of the phone might not think that it can.
No, the person that's doing the selling. Like, and let's say if it's
Uh,
your product that you've created, your blood, sweat, and tears, but you're not sure that it will change the world, even though other people have validated that. What's the best way to get over that mental hump of like talking about your thing? Because I feel like so many women struggle with that.
So I think there's two things here. The first thing is that you're never going to know unless you try, right? That you're asking a question that's impossible to answer. So you've got to ask a different question, right? The idea is that you find the people who do take advantage of it and do get the help. Some people are not going to, some people will, right? But the idea is that you can't answer that question unless you make the offer. Does that make sense? Like
Absolutely.
you don't know if it's gonna change the world, but you're not gonna know unless you take the risk and put yourself out there and ask for that sale and have those conversations. And the second thing is you can't think your way through fear. I wish you could. I wish there was some magic affirmation you could say or some amazing thing that you could put in headphones and listen to that would take all that fear away. But the only way through fear is action. You have to give yourself a different experience. So it's asking yourself if you're willing to give yourself the experience of stepping through the fear, and then you just got to pick up the phone and do it. It's the only way through the fear, because you can't intellectualize through it, you can't rationalize through it. It's in your body and you feel it, and you can't not feel it until you step through it. It's like standing in line and get on a roller coaster, right? You're seeing this roller coaster, you know you want to do it, and yet there's this voice in your head that says, well, what if it flies off the tracks? What if it gets stuck upside down? What if the seat breaks and I go flying off into the crowd? Like, you come up with all these reasons why you shouldn't get on the roller coaster, but you're still in line, you're still heading that way because there's a piece of you that knows it's going to be great. Get on the roller coaster, get off the roller coaster, and then you want to get right back on it again. And I think sales is very similar to that. The more that you do it, the more that you really find that it's very fun. You build a love of it, and the fear becomes very, very quiet. But you have to do it for the fear to become very, very quiet.
I love that. I'm so glad. I'm so glad. I was like, I just have to ask this one question because I think it's so many of us. There's so many people that I talk to that are like, how do I get over the fear? And it's like, you just got to do it. You just got to go for it. That's how you get around it. So I'm glad that I'm glad that you mentioned that. I love the roller coaster analogy. I'm totally going to steal that because I think that you're so right. That's exactly like that, like, ooh, in the pit of your stomach, but you still do it. And then you get off the roller coaster. You're like, that was freaking amazing. So, so if people want to know more about you, where can they find you? Where can they connect with you? Because they are just like, oh my gosh, this girl, I love her. I need to know more about her. Where can they find you at?
So 2 places. We have our own podcast called the Successful Mind Podcast that covers every single business topic you can imagine. Right now, we're finishing up a series on leadership, which does include sales, because you've got to lead yourself first. And you can also follow me on Instagram. My Instagram account is at Steph, Steph Tuss. I put out lots of great content, tips, tactics. So you can check us out in those 2 places.
Awesome. And I'll be sure to link that in the show notes as well. So if someone is running or in the car, they can find easy access to it inside the show notes. Thank you again so much for visiting with me today. I feel like this topic, there's so much out there. So many people need help with sales. So thank you for spending your valuable time with us.
It was my pleasure.